So while the Hellenistic world was developing in the eastern portion of the Mediterranean, a parallel culture in the western Mediterranean that was influenced by both Greeks and Phoenicians and was making its most important impact on the city-state of Rome was developing. This is a map of several of the different peoples of the late Iron Age of Italy. When we're speaking of the Iron Age of West Asia and the Mediterranean, we generally are talking about something that lasts from around 1200 to around 500 BCE. Rome was a village settled by Latin-speaking peoples, right near the mouth of the Tiber River. This portion of the Latin tribes had settled down somewhere between the 8th or 7th century BCE, calling their village Rome. And at first they were ruled by chieftains or possibly kings, we could call them. As a matter of fact, for a while in the 6th century, they were ruled by outsiders, by the Etruscans. And the Etruscans had brought a lot of Greek culture with them, not because the Etruscans themselves were Greek, but because they had had so much interaction with the Greeks. It's the Etruscans who introduced the Romans to aqueducts and the phonetic alphabet. At the end of the 6th century, the Roman aristocracy, along with the people, threw their kings out, forming a new system of government which they called the Republic, a system still headed up by the aristocrats, but influenced by the commoners. It's worth noting that this is around the same time that democracy was appearing in Greece. The Romans were an exceptionally militant culture. The city was governed by a league group of aristocrats referred to as the Senate. Senate literally just means body of old men. Before joining the Senate, though, aristocrats had to actually take some time to serve their city. Usually this meant they served as officers in the army, though sometimes they served in civil postings as well. The offices that the aristocrats had available to them were similar to offices that had been used by the Phoenicians, particularly the Phoenicians within Carthage. Roman authority was extraordinarily decentralized. They made sure to do things like keep the judges separate from the military commanders. Even the highest office, the office that headed up the entire military, the office of consul, C-O-N-S-U-L, not council, consul. That office was always made up of two men. They had to work together, and they were a check on each other's power. Within this militant culture, however, the power of the citizenry, just like within Greece, was affecting politics. The Senate, that body of aristocrats who ran the state, had to submit most of their decisions to the people for a vote. And the voting assembly was the army. Indeed, the soldiers within the army got to vote on who would be consul, the people that would be their generals. Now, in this system where the aristocracy rose through the ranks by going to war, and where commoners were able to supplement their income through war booty, the common practice would be to sow one's fields in the spring, leave their family and slaves to tend the fields while they go off to war, steal stuff from people they conquered, come back home and harvest their crops. This citizen, soldier, farmer was the Republican ideal of a man. This should sound familiar to students of early American history. Now, initially this army was just a militia defense force, but as they became more successful against their surrounding enemies, they just turned these into yearly campaigns. Little by little, they conquered lands around them, and they didn't turn those lands into provinces. They simply turned them into allies, requiring taxes and requiring them to send troops during times of war. They also gave the upper class of the people they conquered citizenship within Rome. This soft-handed touch of expanding their authority served the Romans quite well. They were always respectful of other people's cultures, but most other peoples ended up integrating themselves into Roman culture over the course of a generation or two. Now, just to give you an idea of how tenacious the Romans were as warriors, in the year 280 BCE, there was only one part of Italy that was still left unconquered. That was the southern end, where several Greek city-states had already been set up. As a matter of fact, the Pythagoreans that we had talked about earlier lived down in the southern boot of Italy. When they attacked, those Greek city-states sent for help from a king from Greece, a man named Pyrrhus. You can kind of see the spelling of his name here, except for it ends with a US instead of an IC. Pyrrhus was an astounding king, and he came over with his own force to fight against the Romans, soundly defeating them the first year. And so he went back home thinking the job was done. But then the Romans came back the next year, and he had to come back once again. And of course, he had less men to draw upon. But the Romans, with their system of allies, were able to continually call up new men to fight. By the time we get to the year 275 BCE, after battling the Romans all over southern Italy and the island of Sicily, this little bit right here, Pyrrhus finally had to give up. Even though he didn't lose any battles, he didn't have enough men to keep up with the Romans, which leads to a modern term that you should be aware of, a Pyrrhic victory, which is simply a victory that comes at such a great a cost, it might as well be a defeat. After finishing off their conquest of Italy in the 3rd century, the Romans took their war to Carthage, which again had colonies in North Africa, Sicily, the island of Sardinia and Corsica, and southern Spain. The wars they fought with the Carthaginians were called the Punic Wars, Punic. They were called these because the Romans referred to the Carthaginians as Punici, Latin for Phoenicians. In 202 BCE, at the end of the Second Punic War, the Romans were able to defeat Carthage and take all of its colonies. This required Rome to create a new system of provinces in order to govern their empire. You couldn't count on these newly forced allies across the sea in Spain or Greece to send tribute or taxes whenever required. It wasn't the same situation they were dealing with in Italy. And in order to govern these new provinces, they sent out senators to govern for specified terms. And these senators essentially got to rule as dictators within their provinces. They made tons of money off the land that had been conquered by regular, everyday Roman citizens. They also got used to acting independently, not having to work with a colleague like the two consuls had to, or within the entire Senate. In 146 BCE, Rome finished the conquest of Greece. At this point, Rome was still technically a republic, but the aristocrats were starting to focus more on their overseas holdings. They were less willing to work nicely with each other when they were back home. And by the time we get to the late 2nd century BCE, senatorial politics were starting to turn violent. As a matter of fact, a couple of aristocrats were killed by their peers. Additionally, these citizen soldier farmers that had made up the army weren't able to just go on a summer campaign over to Spain or Greece. By the time we get to around the year 100 BCE, Roman generals were starting to pay their soldiers directly. Soldiers were starting to become more loyal to individual generals, not to the Republic, and Rome suffered from a series of civil wars throughout the 1st century BCE. These wars weren't concluded until the year 31 BCE, when a man named Octavian was actually the adopted son of Julius Caesar. In 31 BCE, Octavian won the final civil war. In the process, he took Egypt as a Roman province, wiping out the last Hellenistic kingdom of the Ptolemies. Over the next few years, he slowly accrued more personal power in the Senate. And in the year 27 BCE, the Senate gave him a new name, Augustus. Augustus translates as the increaser, or the illustrious one. It had very semi-divine overtones, almost godlike. Beginning in 27 BCE, Rome now had a single commander, very different from the chief leadership of the two consuls. This is usually when historians say that the Republic died and the Empire was born. As a matter of fact, Augustus often referred to himself with the military title of commander. The Latin word for commander is imperator, emperor. Now we can say the Republic died in 27 BCE with the establishment of Augustus's rule, but Rome had been an empire for almost 200 years before then. Empire doesn't necessarily mean bad, though. Augustus stabilized the system. He created a machinery that even did well underneath several terrible emperors. He created what we call the Pax Romana, a period of unparalleled peace and prosperity throughout West Asia, the Mediterranean, and Europe. It lasted throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries CE.